Ursun himself lies dying, fatally wounded in the Forge of Souls.
A dying god. The finest corpse from which to brew a plague.
A god pox, mighty Kugath.
A god pox. Why you tempt me, old man? But I cannot reach the Forge of Souls. The Maelstrom prevents us.
I can breach it and guide you to the dying bear.
And why would you do this, little healthy mortal?
For a single drop of Ursun's blood. That is my fee.
Blood for you, the body for me.
Warhammer, whether you're in the realms of men in the fantasy universe or mincing Tyranids in the 41st millennium, it's all grimdark. A world where there are no good guys, but there are certainly some very bad guys. One of those characters is Nurgle, the chaos god of plagues, decay, and death, sometimes referred to as Grandfather Nurgle. If you are a Warhammer fan and you've clicked on this video because of the title, let me just start by saying that I'm sorry for the clickbaity title. I don't actually think that Nurgle shouldn't be considered a chaos god, but in the purest form of what would be considered chaos in science, Nurgle's domain doesn't really fit the bill compared to the other three chaos gods. Now, science isn't the answer to everything, which is the point of this video, but for now, free your mind from the influence of the Emperor, dive into heresy with me, as I spend my time making an argument, and then totally debunking that line of thought later in the video, for educational purposes. This is my channel, Hemiglobin, where I delve into the intersection between science and media and society, but from more of a social science perspective. I'm also really excited about this video because that means I get to use and record gameplay using one of my favorite games of all time, Total War Warhammer 3. So come with me into the rot-infested realms of plagues while I explain why Nurgle isn't a chaos god, at least according to science. Okay, so if we're going to put our debate lord, entirely logical thinking hats on for a second, we have to specify some definitions. First of all, what is chaos? Originally defined from mythology, Warhammer's chaos realms actually fit quite well with the mythological concept of endless voids of nothingness beyond harboring the unknown. Scary far realm stuff, basically. In Greek mythology, chaos is a primordial soup, but is also personified as a kind of deity, considering many gods are born from chaos, quote unquote. But in a modern day usage, chaos probably conjures images of Black Friday sales at Target, planning a group project with too many cooks in the kitchen, or Dungeons and Dragons alignments. Chaos, in a modern sense, is random chance, acting on something because of a feeling, not being guided by your own rules or others, a lack of control in a situation. In terms of the D&D alignment system, chaos and lawfulness are distinct from good and evil because someone can follow laws but be entirely selfish, and others can be criminals wanted by the law but fundamentally become good people. I'm not going to argue that the chaos gods aren't evil in this. They're all evil. So for this video, I'm talking about chaos in a modern sense, which is, to the chaos gods of Warhammer, they fit pretty well into that. I also use the term order a lot, which is primarily because the opposite of chaos is order, and the good guys in Warhammer are, in the Warhammer fantasy universe specifically, are called the forces of order often. In Warhammer, for those unfamiliar, there are four main chaos gods. Khorne, the god of anger and violence and blood. Fun guy. Tzeentch, the god of change, transformation, sorcery. Slaanesh, the god of pleasure, ecstasy, and desires. And Nurgle, the god of death, decay, and diseases. There's also like a shadow chaos god dude who doesn't have a lot of lore. There's a chaos god of angry short dwarves who have really tall hats. In Age Sigmar's timeline, the Horned Rat, leader of the Skaven rat people, becomes a full-time chaos god, but we're not going to talk about him in this video, or them. You can probably infer where the chaos ties into those descriptions, but I'm going to dig into them a little bit individually to see what I mean in terms of this like societal chaos that I'm talking about. Khorne, known for the famous phrase, blood for the blood god, is all about fighting. In the lore, Khorne also has an ideology which says Khorne does not care from where the blood flows. To be a follower of Khorne, you must always be fighting, and if there are any humans or elves to crush in front of you, you kill them, but if you can't fight them, you start fighting your friends. The blood must flow regardless of who it's flowing from. How will Khorne sit on his throne made of skulls if you don't add more skulls to it constantly? Khorne follows the chaos ideology through that wanton violence. Sure, it's evil to stab anyone who's standing in front of you, but that lack of control over just straight bloodlust and just acting on that is what I would consider to be chaotic, and I think most would probably agree. Tzeentch represents what most people would consider chaos in a technical sense. The true random chance and mutation is the magic of the Changer. They focus on illusions and warping reality itself. In tabletop, they have a rule where you roll dice at the beginning of the game to foresee outcomes of the game, but those dice are entirely random, even if when you decide to use those is ordained by the player. Tzeentch is like playing a blue deck in Magic, which for those who aren't familiar is the anime pushing up glasses stereotype, but as a deck. A lot of card and tabletop games rely on luck and random chance, and Tzeentch wants to utilize those odds so that the dice roll in their favor constantly. They're essentially wrangling chaos. Fate, the concept, can often be thought of in sometimes of an ordered statistical way, but Tzeentch specializes in altering the plan of the universe.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
The next one is Slaanesh, which people tend to demean as the sex demon, which, yes, plenty of that in the realms of Slaanesh, but I think Slaanesh's domain is much wider and scarier. That was an unintentional innuendo I wrote in the script, but it's just hard when you're talking about Slaanesh. God fucking damn it. Slaanesh covers pleasure and desire, but equally so targets excess. You've heard of the phrase that everything is good in moderation. Slaanesh hates that ideology. The chaos of Slaanesh lies in a commitment to entirely listening to your base desires without consideration for the world around you. It's kind of aligns with the concept of Sigmund Freud's id, which is the unconscious mind's wants and desires. Slaanesh seeks to fire the neurotransmitters off in your brain constantly and in extreme excess. They would honestly be extremely powerful in our modern era, as Slaanesh would feast on people's constant need to consume content on social media. Freud's ideology also includes the ego and the superego, which are supposed to stop you from this extreme indulgence. It's rational cognition versus chaotic desires that go against what is accepted in society. Now, Nurgle doesn't really have a chaotic element to it at first glance. The three I mentioned earlier were death, decay, and plagues. I'll briefly go over death and decay, but mostly I want to focus on plagues for this video. Death is a bit simple. It's an ordered thing that everyone dies, but I think Nurgle's form of death is specific. It's natural or biological death. Dying at random, i.e. the very small chance that you get struck by lightning, is much more of a Tzeentch thing, while being murdered definitely falls under Khorne, and Slaanesh is like dying as a daredevil in an extreme sport. Death has a scientific process to it. It's the failure of your organs, it's neurons that stop firing electrical signals, your heart stops pumping blood. Interestingly, biological death doesn't exist in all creatures because they have some ways to get around this shutdown. Some jellyfish, lobsters, and flatworms are biologically immortal because their cells have mechanisms to continuously replicate, avoiding damage to their DNA, which is the largest thing that can cause people to die usually. I actually know a laboratory that studies flatworms, and their goal is to understand why you can cut them into 279 pieces and get 280 worms back as they endlessly regenerate. I can't decide if that makes flatworms the ultimate worshiper of Nurgle, or if that means they're just built different to resist his influence in the name of Sigmar. Nurgle's domain is over death like this, but he doesn't really have control over when it happens. Nurgle can always be like, "Woe, plague be upon ye," but oftentimes Nurgle keeps people alive when they're sick to maximize suffering because he's a cool dude like that. And plagues themselves are not actually that chaotic either in how they function, which we'll get to. But first, let's talk about decay. So decay, again, kind of an ordered process here as well. Decay is broadly used to describe the breakdown of an organism's body. It's actually mostly driven by fungi and bacteria, and decay doesn't mean you're gone entirely. Isaac Newton wrote some laws and stuff and said some things that said something matter can't be destroyed, and that's true for your body as well. That 60% of water in your body has to go somewhere when you die, and generally, if you die in the woods, it will seep back into the earth or be used elsewhere, evaporating into the air. This is actually starting to sound like Nurgle is more of a wood elf than he is a chaos god, but don't tell Tree Lord Durthu than that, otherwise he would crush me for saying that in his presence. This also puts in some fun context for factions like the Tomb Kings in the fantasy setting, which are basically ancient Egyptians. And ancient Egyptians are famous for having scientifically understood the process of decay and how to slow it through mummification, which must provide them some kind of resistance to Nurgle's influence, actually. How the body breaks down is well documented, although I'm not an expert in that field, so I'm not going to try to explain it in a more technical sense. Something I am kind of familiar in is chemical breakdown. Chemical breakdown is also ordered. Every chemical has a known half-life, which is the amount of time it takes for half of any given chemical to break down. Caffeine in your body breaks down 100 milligrams of the 200 milligrams you just slammed in your C4 energy drink in 3 to 5 hours. But caffeine sitting on a shelf will take years to break down 100 milligrams. It's environmentally dependent, this bacteria is in your body, is it on a shelf. You may have also heard of forever chemicals like PFAS or Teflon. Those have a half-life of 2 to 8 years inside your body. It's more like 40 years outside in a lake somewhere. For context, it takes about 5 full half-lives for something to be ever considered truly gone enough. Unlike Nurgle, these chemicals are man-made horrors, which are within my comprehension, unfortunately. Warhammer 40,000, more like PFAS 40,000. This is a PSA to email your local politician and tell them to start making regulations around chemicals like PFAS before they stick around until the 41st millennium. It's not just chance that these chemicals break down, it's an ordered statistical rate in which they do so. Same goes for decay in organisms. So to me, scientifically, Nurgle is 0 for 2 for having control over chaotic elements of mortal existence. But what about plagues? Spreading diseases randomly amongst the peasants of Bretonnia surely is chaotic, right? However, diseases also have really specific biological mechanisms that I wouldn't consider to be chaotic. We're going to touch on 3 types of diseases. Pull out your iPhone 4 and load up Plague Incorporated because we are going to get a bit technical. However, I do just want to preface that I normally won't go into that much science detail in my channel, but I am a biochemist, so I'm going to take advantage of the knowledge that I do have. If more hardcore science is not your thing, I hope you'll stick around anyways, because I'm going to try to explain everything in a way that everyone will enjoy. And the point more is talking about how these mechanisms are ordered, We're going to talk about 3 types of plagues that Nurgle is emboldened by and loves spreading to others: bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Let's start with bacteria. Bacteria are single-celled organisms which form colonies, and they have their own DNA, but they are only a single cell unit. These colonies can exist in many places, but primarily when bacteria enters your body and starts colonizing somewhere it should not be, you get an infection. The infection causes an immune response in your body, which fights off the bacteria. Normally, this is a grueling process for your body, but the modern discovery of antibiotics allows faster recovery than in the past. And more importantly, destruction of the entire colony. Otherwise, they will come back and they will get you. Take your antibiotics. There's this misconception often that bacteria equals bad, but actually, many of the bacteria in the world are good for the world. Bacteria break down chemicals like we discussed previously, but they're also used in manufacturing processes and also in your gut to process food. You may have heard of the gut microbiome, which is a term for all those bacteria that live in your gut. E. coli, a famous invader of Chipotle lettuce, actually is in your gut, but it only makes you sick when it's colonized in the rest of your body. You might be thinking, well, if I take antibiotics, don't my gut bacteria die? Yeah, actually, but it's never enough to kill them outright. So they recognize and they recolonize and they survive. This is why you always get told to eat when you take antibiotics, or if you don't eat when you take antibiotics, you might feel a little sick and get a little bit of a tummy ache. The sickness and disease of bacteria comes from the constant reproduction of the colony flaring your immune system. That's not chaotic. In fact, they reproduce just like any other organism. Additionally, the process is no different than in sickness than it is in your gut. A bacteria trying to survive by forming more bacteria might make you sick when it's done in the wrong place, but reproduction is not really a particularly chaotic process. Next, let's talk about viruses. With bacteria, we talked about this biological replication and how that is not particularly chaotic. Viruses also endlessly replicate, so a similar argument here too, but here I want to talk more about the mechanism of infection. Viruses work through attaching to your cells, they release their genetic information into your cells, and they utilize your cell's machinery to make more viruses. The ability to attach to your cell requires a biological mechanism that has existed for a long time. If you're familiar with what COVID looks like, you'll probably notice these little spiky bits, which are aptly named spike proteins. Nice. Not all viruses have these spikes, but all that use their surface to attach to cells. You know what else uses those surfaces? Your immune system. When your body picks up on a virus, it remembers what the surface of that virus looked like, or the spikes, or some other thing that is attaching to your cells, and then when it comes back into your body, it will hunt that virus again if you get affected. Once enough people stop getting sick, the virus changes, not in some random way, but in a way that gets past those defenses. Viruses evolve quickly. It's why it feels like there's a new COVID strain every year, and why the flu needs a different vaccine every single year. It's like if you had a locksmith who came into your house and changed your locks like every year, you then have to spend some time every year trying to figure out how to get a new key made. Otherwise, you wouldn't get into your house. Not that your house is your body or that viruses get to be in your body, but I guess the point of me going through that mechanism is that while viral infection can feel like a corruption of your cells, it's not actually chaotic or evil. It just is. The virus is attached to cells and how they use your cell's machinery. It's all a design, a mechanism that can change and be altered in the interest of survival. In fact, viruses and their mechanisms are sometimes beneficial to organisms. Bacteriophages can kill bacteria that are causing a especially Nurgle infection. Some viruses work symbiotically to survive in the host while benefiting them through eliminating other stressors. There are also some ancient viruses that have embedded their DNA into our DNA over time. Point being, viruses just infect through well-defined mechanisms, something that in a scientific perspective would be considered ordered. Alright, one final one, parasites. Nurgle certainly has claim over parasites, considering one of his favored sons is Tamarkon, the maggot lord. Tammy here is a parasite in every definition of the world. He's actually a maggot that when he kills something, he can take over their body and use it as his new form. Gnarly. Parasites, unlike the other two, are never a good thing, unlike the other two I've discussed. You may remember from high school biology the idea of symbiosis. There are 3 types of symbiosis, one of which is parasitism. Mutualism benefits both organisms, commensalism benefits one but doesn't bother the other one, and parasitism actively harms the organism while benefiting. However, parasites don't just harm creatures just to harm them, or because they're evil. They do it to survive. Man, I'm really starting to sound like a heretic on this one. Parasites, by design, do not survive long when they are not attached to a host or within a host. Some worms choose the non-parasite life, but those that don't need to survive somehow. They do it through preying on agricultural crops or nutrients from bodies. That's not a good thing for the organism having to deal with the parasite, but regardless, it's not particularly chaotic. Humans actively harm plants every day by harvesting and farming them, but we don't consider that chaotic. Some would argue that we are parasites of Earth, but we benefit from it, so we don't view our impact on the planet as endlessly chaotic interactions in most scenarios, even though it kind of is. I have one final note about diseases in general that I've been kind of skipping over. A large mechanic of playing Nurgle is spreading plagues, and one might think the act of spreading a large plague seems chaotic, and in some sense it is, as it's this uncontrollable thing making people sick, but from a scientific perspective, the field of epidemiology might have a different opinion. No matter the plague or the illness, across populations, once a good amount of people get sick and their outcomes are assessed, you will find that there's a very consistent chance that a plague will spread to someone, B, they get sick from it, and C, they die from it. To give Nurgle some credit, in Total War Warhammer, the plague mechanic entirely centers around changing these elements of a plague in the same way that Tzeentch alters fate. It seems that Nurgle can alter biological mechanisms, which is kind of a cool fantasy magic world building thing. Is Nurgle a scientist? Oh no. However, without Nurgle's influence, in the real world, many diseases just change on their own for evolution, like we talked about with viruses. Mutations and change are often associated with Tzeentch, but diseases do it all the time, and regularly. Maybe this is one of the reasons why Nurgle and Tzeentch hate each other. All of this to say, from a scientific perspective, I don't entirely think that Nurgle is a chaos god. Just because small organisms make people sick, and their life and their mechanisms, they're actually quite order-like. Animals and plants are always thought to be part of the forces of order, but microorganisms contribute to the cycle of life as well. But the reality of Nurgle, and the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place, is that the scientific perspective is not always the right perspective. Warhammer is a bit of an extreme example for this, but imagine you are a Kossar of Kislev living in a fantasy Russian town, and suddenly, a large, bloated green demon swinging a rusted belt walks into town and cleaves someone in half right in front of you. You're not going to come out of that situation saying, there's a rational explanation for this. You're going to go say, Holy Urson, that thing is evil, and chaos has come to this land. The chaotic and evil nature of Nurgle is that diseases can be scary. Getting sick is not fun. Plagues feel uncontrollable. To use an example from our world that relates to fantasy and medieval settings, everyone is surely knowledgeable of the Black Death, one of the most famous plagues of the Middle Ages. We now know it to have been a bacteria that was spread by rats and fleas all across Europe and Asia. But at the time, with people not knowledgeable about the existence of bacteria, they sought an explanation for the fear and sickness regardless. Some settled on it being a divine punishment from God. Others believed it to be corrupting influence of the devil coming to Earth. No film captures this feeling more than The Seventh Seal. If you're a fan of older movies that are absolute bangers, this 1957 black and white movie follows a knight's confrontation with death as he returns to a plague-ridden Sweden after a crusade. It captures various people dealing with the pandemonium of the Black Death, how it destroyed society, what people believed it to be. There's actually a super ominous scene with flagellants, which was a historical group of people who would punish themselves with whips, believing that they needed to repent for their sins to avoid death from God's wrath. Ironically, all of those open wounds probably just led to their death faster than those who did not punish themselves. And there's actually a unit in Warhammer called flagellants that are inspired off of this. The movie personifies death as this inevitable person that you play in an endless game of chess, but you always lose. It gives the vibe of a Bretonnian knight conflicting with the end times that Nurgle has brought to the world. The Black Death, while way worse on a technical level, is similar to many other plagues, including the COVID-19 pandemic 6 years ago. I read a great article by Jonathan Clark called My Flesh is Afraid, Watching the Seventh Seal in a Pandemic, which goes over the feeling of watching the Seventh Seal during COVID-19's most deadly years. A great read that gets to the point that the plague destroys society and causes endless fear no matter what the explanation is. I just want to say, before I go further into this next session, I'm going to talk about some topics that may seem that some may deem political. And I just want to say that if you're conservative, if you're liberal, if you're moderate in the United States watching this video, you are welcome here. I have my biases and I say some things sometimes that make people feel ostracized, and I'm sorry ahead of time if it does do that. We all want the same things. We all want to be healthy, and I think it's beneficial to engage with our current situation in the world when discussing this topic. All right, I'm getting off my pedestal. COVID-19 was obviously a mess, and I want to take all of what I said into one point surrounding it. Scientists really struggled with communications during COVID, not necessarily on a risk assessment level. All those 6-foot markers were helpful for seeing how far you need to stay away from people. But where scientists really messed up is, and where we continue to mess up to this day, is it through addressing the very real fears that exist in a moment like a pandemic. People were afraid of the virus, but many communication strategies stoked the fire rather than helped it. We told people information with certainty, even when there was uncertainty, because we were afraid that if we said, I'm not 100% confident, people would turn away. But when new information did come out, i.e. you don't have to wash your groceries, people became distrustful, somewhat reasonably. We spent the pandemic participating in negative framing. People didn't want to wear masks all the time. It became a political talking point. And while yes, masks are effective, we told people who didn't want to wear one that they could die, they could spread it to someone, they could kill their parents. Negative framing doesn't work. The response is to continue to seek alternatives because the authoritative communications incentivize people to not engage with the negativity. We would have been better off saying, you're doing a good thing for your community, or you're keeping your family safe and you're reducing risk. You're doing a good thing, right? Like this is a community effort. We're all doing this together. We're all in this together. Further than that, we struggled obtaining herd immunity because a large portion of the population did not want to get vaccinated. This was somewhat driven by politics of the time, but scientists and medical professors didn't help much either. The real fear around vaccines can be quite reasonable when you strip away logic and focus on emotion. Some don't like needles. Some don't know what they're putting in their body. Some already have fractured trust in doctors. Some just hate the government telling them what to do. We certainly all have that moment where we felt not listened to by our doctors. But the response to the fear was just advertisements and source links that say, the vaccine's safe, trust me, bro, instead of actually trying to address the fears that made people hesitant. The fear of plagues, and in some sense, is no different from fearing a vaccination. The science says one will make you safe and one will make you sick. But the reality is that people are afraid of both, and no amount of scientific evidence will ever break through that barrier of fear. I think Nurgle represents all of what I've just talked about, and that is the unconditional fears of the unknown, the downfall of structured society, the departure of logical reasoning. That is what makes Nurgle a chaos god. Plagues, decay, and death are simply instruments in Nurgle's toolkit to cause the suffering and chaos that he wants to inflict. The other gods are no different, other than that they have these things in their definitions. Khorne uses anger to stoke the flames. Tzeentch causes unpredictable change to confuse your mind. Slaanesh uses excess to make you amenable to servitude. It can sometimes feel like in our world the chaos gods are real. And I mean, all art has its inspirations, in this case, unfortunately. Khorne is emboldened by the seemingly endless wars and conflicts, with the worst of the worst being more than one school shooting a week in America. Tzeentch gains power every time someone is convinced of a new reality by an AI chatbot, believing that the real human connection is not necessary, molding their minds to the wills of an algorithm. Slaanesh, as we discussed, would feast on the content mill of social media, but it's also the powerful people participating in parties to fan their ego and indulge in heinous acts. And Nurgle, other than the fear spread by plagues, Nurgle makes you feel like that there's something out to get you. The larger world must be wrong and will not protect you, be it vaccines, immigrants, agents of another country, communists. Nurgle wants you to be afraid, because then you turn to Nurgle. Unlike the other Chaos gods, you can find a myriad of videos on YouTube where people argue that Nurgle is, if you had to worship one, the best choice. This is because his diseases are described as gifts. The pus-filled people are said to be overfilled with joy from Nurgle's blessings. This is by design. It makes me think of alternative health influencers who claim that there's some bold new strategy that only they know of, and if you engage with a real doctor, it will lead to your death. They use the very rational fear of, I don't want to die from cancer, to peddle some miracle cure for your health that will cure all your problems, which in some case might actually be bad for you, in the same way that Nurgle's diseases fill you with pus. RFK Jr. Has very rationally called for better health regulations on processed foods, and yes, ultra sugary food is not great to be consumed as much as it is in America, but the alternative for him, in his mind, is unregulated peptide infections, putting blue dye in your water. Not to mention the fact that RFK Jr. was once infected by TomerCon. I don't want to be super doomer bringing this all up, but the art of Warhammer and those perceptions of Nurgle as a chaos god come from somewhere. Fear has incubated with humanity since we could feel emotions, and the downfall of societies ruled by fear has happened before. But you're probably wondering, after all of this, how do you deal with Nurgle? The witch hunters in Warhammer Fantasy just execute the plagued people in the world, and, well, the world largely ended anyway at the hands of Nurgle. So authoritarianism and force obviously doesn't work. Also adding that I'm not a psychologist, so if you struggle from anger issues, extreme indulgence, or coping with your own reality, I'm really not the guy for that, but I do know a lot about how people think about fear and how people, peer pressure and social groups. I know stuff about that. The social science books and articles that I've read has given me a good idea of how one would avoid a fall to Nurgle, or even better, bring people back from their fall to chaos. Welcome to my 3-step guide to resisting the influence of Nurgle. And by that I mean how to talk to real people who are afraid of something that you would deem irrational. Step 1, start by listening to them. Ask them why they are hesitant to get a vaccine, for example, and keep digging with questions, only responding with your thoughts when they ask you. This lets them consider their own thoughts and understand whether they are well-founded or not, because oftentimes they're not. You want them to change their own mind. You can't convince them with facts. They need to think it out themselves, and you can also, in the process, learn something about how they are thinking about this and get more empathetic because of that, instead of just yapping at them that they're wrong. Also, when someone concedes in answering questions and they decide to ask you questions, that is a sign of trust, and you should cherish that. Step 2, relate to them. Someone is going to be a lot more able to listen to you if you share personal stories of your own beliefs, not in a factual way, but experiences and emotions. In a Warhammer sense, I once thought of the straying from the Lady of Bretonia, but my chivalry was renewed when the Green Knight came to my aid in my darkest hour. Or in a more modern sense, you might explain why you trust the medical community in a specific recommendation. What experiences led you to that trust? Maybe they will empathize with that. Step 3, don't be a jerk. 99% of heretics were told they were making a bad decision before they fell to chaos, and making fun of them for it just makes them go deeper into the realms of chaos. Frame your points positively. Reassure them that their fears are human and real, but that fear shouldn't rule them or their decisions. Being a jerk will only work to solidify the thought that they are onto something, that they figured it out, and you're trying to make them feel bad as a tactic to draw them away from the truth, not the other way around, which is you want to help them, right? You don't want people to fall to Nurgle, right? It's bad. These things I talked about are backed up with various social science studies and sources, and I'll link those in the comments if you're interested, but it would get a bit boring to kind of crank through every study after study. Unless you're interested in a video like that, comment below if you are, I guess, but I'm guessing no. We also just went over how logic can kind of suck when you're communicating, so that's why I just assumed. So at the end of the day, Nurgle is a chaos god. Sorry for the rage bait at the beginning. Maybe not in a scientific definition of chaos when you look at the tools he uses, but the reason I wanted to make this video is that scientists tend to think that facts are king, but we've only really had modern science for the last 100, 200 years or so. The reality is that people are dominated by their own experiences and emotions and beliefs. That's not wrong, it's human, but we really have to do a better job at addressing that reality instead of just being like, why don't you read my CDC page on why you're super wrong? Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you learned something about how science interacts with society through my nerdy and exaggerated metaphors. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe. I've got many more videos down the pipeline related to this topic. Have a good day. I wonder if in the end times, I wonder if it could have been prevented if people were just nicer to each other and had more empathy. Probably not. Yeah, no, definitely not.